So to give you an illustration of how different children can be, all three of the boys have been very lovey-dovey this morning. Everywhere I go, hi Dad, I love you Dad, I'll give you a hug. Clara comes up and punches me in the stomach and kicks me in the ankle and sticks down her tongue at me. It's her way. It's not like she means it. It's her way of showing affection, but it's just to say.
Usually that comes from boys, not girls.
I know. Well, the problem was she was the first, and so Daddy doted on her and may have influenced her too much. So it goes.
I noted on Weston when he was and his Brady come along, there was jealousy.
Of course. That's the way of it, though. I cannot imagine Weston ever kicking anyone in the shins. Brady either, honestly. They're both very respectful kids.
Yeah,
Which shows I've just gone wrong as a father.
He'd just sit there and pout when I held Brady on my lap.
Which is sweet. But... All right, well, welcome aboard here. Today, I completely expect we will be finishing with our look at the kings of Israel. Only took us like 5 months, not too bad, honestly. No, not even that long, because we started this in Lent. Because the sermon series was on the kings of Judah, and figured we'd do both that way. So we are on 2 Kings, chapter... Let me get my pages going. There's Hezekiah. Oh my goodness. I'm way too far in. Chapter 17. We'll give the kids a second to regale us, so I don't have to shout too loud. The piano sounds very in tune. All right, well, we are on verse 7. We might remember last time we talked about Hoshea, as well as a few other things before him, but Hoshea as the last king of Israel, how he was a wicked king, not quite as wicked as the others, but still his confidence was not in the Lord, particularly to a high degree. In fact, he was conquered by Assyria, made a vassal king. He was a puppet state, basically, that paid tribute to the king of Assyria. But he didn't want that position, who would? And so he tried to make a deal with Egypt to help get enough power to beat back Assyria. That didn't go well for him. Assyria still overcame him, and they exiled the people of Israel. We talked last time about how that was a very effective way of deculturing the Israelites from their identity and, of course, also their religion. And this will be an act that will have reverberations throughout all history. This is not one of those situations where, okay, God exiles them for a while, then he brings them back and everything is more or less normal. Forever after they will be known, or not forever after, but up to the days of Jesus, they will be known by the Jews in Judea as Samaritans, and that will be understood as a slur word because they will be understood as less faithful to the covenant of Abraham and the God of the covenant than the Israelites, than the Judeans themselves. For one thing, they will always have some mixed worship. They will always have these ideas about where to go. You might even remember Jesus with the woman on the well. Do you remember that story more or less? He's in Samaria. He's at a well. A woman comes along. He asks her for a drink. They have a conversation. Did you notice that one of those things that she says to Jesus is, you Jews say we have to go to worship in Jerusalem, but we worship on this or that hill. You remember that little part of the conversation? That is a direct carryover from the Jeroboam corruption manifested all the way to there, and the continued lack of complete faithfulness to the covenants of Abraham. Because whose idea was it to go to Jerusalem to worship? God's. That's where the temple is. So in a very real sense, they are still participating in the sin of Jeroboam all the way up to Jesus' own day. And this is one of the reasons the Jews continue to look down on them. But they also have all kinds of other problems due to their mixed blood, because they started marrying with other nations to a high degree, something again God forbade. And all kinds of corruptions happened from Jeroboam on down to the deportation to Assyria that, like I said, continue to have consequences for generations. Which one point I did not get to make is also this. We talk a lot about the importance of faithfulness for our own time, but just understand that, as we probably know from a lot of specifically heinous sins, certain sins may well be forgiven, yes, and so they won't have eternal significance, but they can have significance down for generations, as was shown in Jeroboam and all of the kings that we've heard. In our own day, one that's an obvious one, let's say an extremely abusive household, what is almost certainly going to happen to the next generation? Not for sure, but what is extremely likely to happen? They carry that abusive violence down to the next generation. Things, even though they may be forgiven, the consequences on earth do not simply disappear. One more reason to guard our hearts and our minds as we walk in faithfulness.
Question.
Yeah,
And this is way into the now here.
sure.
Why are people so against the Jews now? What?
Oh gosh, it depends on who you're talking to. I don't want to get into that big conversation, not only because it's a big issue and it would take us so far afield, mainly because different people have different reasons. Just like some people are very, very favorable towards the Jews for different reasons. Some for political reasons. There are people who say, well, Israel is a very good ally state, and of course we want to help them in that Middle East. Some for religious reasons. Well, the temple must be restored before God comes again, some Christians believe. So therefore we have to support Israel for religious reasons. Some just because, well, I know a lot of Jews and they happen to be really nice people. Same for the hatred side. It can be for all kinds of reasons, political, of I think Israel is a bad state. I think it's unjust that they exist. I think that it was a falsely made nation state. I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm just saying arguments I've heard. People who say that, who are just frankly prejudiced and anti-Semitic, as they say, where they just hate the Jews for all kinds of reasons that people hate any particular people of a race. Why hate black people? I don't understand it, but I understand that people hate them for all kinds of reasons, thinking they're a lesser race, that they're evil, that they're corrupt. So likewise with the Jews. All kinds of different reasons. These days, I think so primarily because of the politics, the various reasons have been amplified on both directions.
I guess I don't remember my history too well, but I don't understand how come so many, like the Nazis, they were wiping them out.
Mm-hmm. Again, this will take us very far afield into a lot of and we can talk about that. If you want to, we can talk more about it next time. How about? I'll only say shortly, for a lot of reasons, the Jews have often been the scapegoats of society, in the sense that when there were huge problems, people liked to identify the Jews as a particularly big source of those problems. Two big reasons tend to jump out. One, faithful Jews are weird in the sense that they don't fit in with the rest of society very well. They have, if they're following the law of Moses as much as they can, and all of the traditions of the Pharisaical addendums to the Old Testament, then they have a life that just is very different. They don't intermarry, they don't eat pork, they don't do all kinds of things, they won't work on the Sabbath, they have a lot of things that make them obviously stand out, even in the way they dress. And when you have a group of people that has a coherent identity that is very different than your own, it's easy to at least look at them as strange. Think of the Amish around here. How many people do you know think, those Amish? I don't know. And the big reason? They're different. And they are collectively coherent as an identity that is different. Now, I'm not saying it's good or bad about them, it's just to say the difference is there. Second, Jews have, because of their cultural values, tended to also be unusually successful as a demographic portion of any given population. because they place such a huge emphasis on education and character formation, a lot of them disproportionately tend to rise to the tops of various industries and nations. And of course, when you have people who are different, who then start to seem to rise disproportionately, and things are going badly, it's though they're taking power to do all kinds of heinous things. So that's one other reason. And in Hitler's case, very much they were a convenient scapegoat for the many social ills that were plaguing Germany at that time. But like I said, we can talk more about it next time if you want.
I just wondered how all of this kept going through the years.
And same reason that people used to hate Christians in the Roman Empire on that score. They were very different, and everybody worried they were up to something no good. All right, good question. Just I want to actually finish this for change, and don't be afraid to ask other questions. It's just to say we can bring that back next time. All right, verses 7 and following. We'll read this whole section. Did we read this last time? I can't remember. I don't think we did. As we read it, remind me. I want somebody to read, if we could, 7 through 12 for us, and we'll just read all the way up to verse 23 later, but somebody read 7 through 12 for me.
All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations of the Lord. The practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the king of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that provoked the Lord to anger.
One more verse.
They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this."
Okay, so up to this point, this is the theological interpretation of why Hosea fell. If you just were operating as a secular atheistic person, you'd say, well, chapter 17, the first part, gives you a perfectly legitimate explanation. Assyria was a more powerful kingdom. They conquered the weaker kingdom. Hosea tried to backdoor deal, and he ate the consequences you could expect if that deal doesn't pay out. That's a perfectly sufficient explanation on the historical political level. It happens to countries all the time throughout history. However, the Bible is not interested in simply saying this is what happened. It gives the theological interpretation of why God allowed this to happen and even directed things so that Hosea and Israel would finally fall. And what's the big list of reasons there from 7 to 12, essentially? What have they been doing?
Worshipping their idols.
Right. They're doing all these things that God strictly forbade. They're worshiping idols. They're inventing places to worship. They're just cooking up all kinds of ways to worship God and to worship false gods. They are, notice it says, they do what the nations that were already driven out before them had done. In other words, all the reasons that God drove out the Canaanites by the Israelites took up and did. So what should happen to them if God judges that the Canaanites ought to have been driven out? Same thing. Only worse, then they add more practices that under the kings of Israel that were even more of an offense. So on the one hand, there's this. There's the initial charge, and this almost proceeds like a legal indictment of why this happens and why this is just. First, God does this. Why? Because they sinned against the Lord, and here's a catalog of some of their sins. And then it goes on to establish how the Lord initially responded to this, because he wasn't just being extraordinarily severe. Somebody want to read verse 13 through 15.
The Lord warned Israel and Judah prophets, and seers. Turn from your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees in accordance with an entire law that I commanded your fathers to obey and that I deliver to you through my servants, the prophets. But they would not listen, and they were as stiff-necked as their fathers, who did not trust the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their fathers and the warnings he had given. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them. Do not do as they do, and they did the things that the Lord had forbidden them to do.
Okay, so first of all, we heard the catalog of their crimes as the justification for the judgment. But then we hear, what does God say? What has God done as the initial response to all of their crimes? Does he just say immediately, you sinned, you're going to jail, goodbye? He warns them. He sends prophets and seers. And we skipped over a lot of kings. This has been going on for several hundred years now, where God has continued to send warning after warning after warning, and trying to tell them, essentially, turn back, obey the law, and what is the implied thing that will happen if they do this? God will overlook their sins, and things will continue swimmingly. So it gives the catalog of sins, the initial response of God to show this was a reasonable, very merciful way of responding, in fact. And how then 14 and 15, they say what's their response? They continue to reject. So despite all of God's ample warnings and ample opportunities and displays of mercy, they reject every single time that the Lord tries to discipline them and bring them back to the truth and to find mercy and life. Calls them a lot of interesting names. First of all, it says they're stiff-necked. What does that mean? Stubborn. Right. It's almost like I envision a horse when you're riding him, and he just will not turn the neck when you're pulling on it. He's going to go his way, and who cares what the rider's trying to get done? Stubbornness. This is not a virtue in regards to God's warnings. Stubbornness can be a good thing if it's directed in the right ways. We don't call it stubbornness, we call it zeal. But when it's directed wrongly and refuses to change even when shown clearly and obviously you are in the wrong and it refuses to change, this is an indictment. So they're stiff-necked. And then notice it has in verse 15 this thing that's very worth spelling out for a minute. They followed worthless idols, and what happens to them as a consequence? They became worthless. The idea here is similar to what Paul writes in Romans, where he talks about whoever you submit yourselves to for willing obedience, you become a slave of that thing. And if you submit yourself to unrighteousness willfully, what's the result? You yourself become the thing you submit yourself to. Unrighteous, and the fruit is death. If you submit yourself to worthless things, it's not to say that you were created worthless and somehow are out of any realm of concern. It's to say you are giving yourself over to something that actually transposes your worth, so that you become what you follow. Kind of like that old saying, if you heard, you are what you eat. The idea being, the more bad things you eat and unhealthy, what happens to you? You become more and more unhealthy. The more good and healthy things you eat, what happens? You become more and more healthy. So likewise, the things you devote yourself to follow changes your trajectory and what you actually become. If you give yourself to honorable, honest, in things with integrity, what is very likely to happen to you as a person? You're going to become a person with more integrity, more virtue. You will become better. By the same token, if you give yourself over to people who lie, who cheat, who only are concerned about themselves, what is going to happen to your character? You're going to become, very likely, a less honest, more self-centered person. And essentially, God is saying, when you follow worthless things, well, you are giving yourself up to this worthlessness. And the end of that is death. All right, 16 through 17.
They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves two idols cast in the shape of calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed down to all the starry hosts, and they worshipped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination,
Yep.
and sorcery, and sold themselves to be evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger.
All right, so it essentially just repeats just how stiff-necked they were. Even as God commands them to do this thing, they show what kinds of people they have become by forsaking everything that the Lord still, by just continuing in this forsaking of God. And notice it's not just, I'm worshiping calves instead of God. I'm worshiping an Asherah pole, and I'm worshiping the starry host and Baal instead of God, but life more or less continues unabated. This is one of the things that people sometimes, have you ever heard people make this case? Doesn't matter what you believe, what matters is how you live. People will say that all the time. And it seems like it would make a certain kind of sense. I mean, what's the big deal if I happen to believe in Allah or the God who is made manifest in Christ, as long as I'm still loving my neighbor and I'm still doing all of these other things that we consider good and decent? What difference does it make? And why would God even care? Now, set aside the question of why should God even care for a moment, and let's ask this: does your behavior stay the same when you believe different things? Let's take the case of the sincere follower of Allah and the sincere follower of Christ. If you are a sincere follower of Allah, one of the things that often seems to come up is your women will have to cover themselves from head to toe. Husbands will eventually start having multiple wives. They will kill the women who don't uphold the dignity and chastity they think is necessary. And they will say that's the loving, appropriate thing to do. Why? Because of who they worship. Who you worship and devote yourselves to has everything to do, like we just said before, of what kind of person you become. When you are devoted to the secular values of America, you become a certain kind of person. Why is it we are constantly being made more and more aware of the increase in living primarily for maximizing our own self-experience as a culture, rather than, say, even ordinary civic duty? Well, because that's what we are worshiping. What you believe changes what you are, and you cannot simply swap out the highest good with another highest good without having a change in some degree of life at the margins. It just will, because that's what it means to be devoted to a thing. Now, there are some things that will more or less overlap in how your life goes, but it will change it. But even setting that, so you see that the Israelites don't just worship these things. What do they do to their sons and daughters? They sacrifice them in the fire in order to get the blessings they think these gods are supposed to give when you make that kind of a sacrifice. We can make a very obvious correlation that's often made. Why do people choose to often kill their children in utero now? Granted, I'm not saying there aren't some very hard, extreme cases that need careful warranting, but by the self-reporting of most people who choose to do it, it is either to spare their child a life of too much suffering, or it is to spare themselves a life of too much suffering. In either case, it's saying a life of a certain amount of suffering that is not full of a sufficient kind of comfort and security is not worth living. And so they sacrifice the children for the sake, either of the child, supposed sake of the child, or for their own sake. Again, the gods you worship direct what kinds of practices you will find acceptable. And it just happens. But now let's go to the part we set aside. Why should God care? I think we've made this point before, so I'll just make it briefly. Why should my wife care which woman I send myself to? I mean, as long as I'm being a good guy in the community, what does it matter whether it's you or some other girl? As long as I am devoted, right? I suspect by that look. I know. But I could tell you how that would go very quickly. And almost nobody would look at me and say, you're absolutely right. I don't know what her problem is. Would you? Most people would say, what kind of an idiot jerk are you? It's your freaking wife. And yet we forget all of that when we come to God. God is the one who made you. God is the one who sustains literally every moment of your life. God is the one who shed his blood on the cross for you. And you're going to say, and who cares if you care what he did for you? As long as you worship some God who isn't anything like that. May as well say, yes, she's your wife, but go and have fun with any woman you feel like, because all my wife cares about is that I'm a good person outside of my marriage. Ridiculous. So, the Lord is right to be angry at these people. Verse 18 through, let's finish it off, 23.
So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left, and even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the practices Israel had introduced. Therefore the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers, until he thrust them from his presence. Then he tore Israel away from the house of David. They made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, their king. Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam and did not turn away from them until the Lord removed them from his presence, as he had warned through all his servants, the prophets. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and they are still there.
All right, so at the time of this writing, the time that the book of 2 Kings was written, they're still there. Now, later on, some would come back, but at the time of this, the judgment is still ongoing. It doesn't have this very specific bounded date like when Judah gets conquered. Now, again, it just kind of summarizes so we have that legal indictment. It says, here's what the Lord did. Here's why he did it. Here's how he tried to get them back on course. Here's how they responded to that. And so here's why God is so thoroughly justified in what he did. And so one more time, we will restate the case that the validity and the justice of God's final judgment against the people by tearing Israel out of their homeland. Again, it's a theological, legal kind of case of a prosecution saying, this is why we praise his name even in the midst of this judgment, because it was just. However, you might have caught in verse 18 that he doesn't just talk about how Israel is so bad. The author of the book of 2 Kings, whoever that is, we don't know who wrote it, obviously knows that there will be some people who are Jewish, who are not part of the people of northern tribes reading this, and he doesn't want them to get it into his head. But that's why Judah is so amazing, because Israel was so bad. You go, Judah, keep doing what you're doing. What does he say? Judah was no better. They followed all the same practices, and therefore the Lord rejects not just the northern kingdom of Israel, he rejects all the people of Israel. When it says all the people of Israel, he's talking about all 12 tribes from from Manasseh down to Judah itself, because all of them followed in the ways. Now, it doesn't mean he utterly rejects them in the way that he will have nothing further to do with them. It is to say, he fulfills the promises he made in the covenant with Moses, and fulfills the threats he made with the people of through the prophets. That if they refuse to follow the Lord their God, he will tear them from the land, chastise them, but not utterly forsake them. He will still keep a remnant who he will call back to himself, who will remain faithful through it all in the end, and who through he will bless all nations of the earth. This is an important thing to say. here. You remember way back in time, God made this promise to Abraham, right? You remember what that promise was, more or less? I know it's been a long time since we talked about it. Right. First of all, he'll have children that will be more numerous than the sands of the seashore, the stars in the sky. That's the one that everybody remembers because it's the easiest to depict. The biggest part of the promise, though, is through your offspring, all families of the earth will be blessed. How is that going to happen if God just says, okay, you guys were too unfaithful. It's over. Goodbye, Judah. Goodbye, Jerusalem. Goodbye, Israel. I'm going to start over. The Mosaic covenant said they would be torn out from his presence if they did not follow it. But the Mosaic covenant is part of, it is underneath and within the confines of the Abrahamic covenant. This one is bigger than this one. This one says, if you do this, this is what I will be for you. If you don't do this, this is what I will be to you. But it all operates within this broader promise to Abraham of the Messiah. So that even when the Mosaic law finds its judgment and return and gets back to Judah with a much chastened, smaller, but more faithful Judah, that line will still carry forward the great promise of God made to Abraham and results in the offspring of Christ who would be a blessing to every family of the earth. Right, when I say Mosaic, I mean, Moses. So I'm talking about the covenant made on Mount Sinai with the people, where God says, you are my people, I brought you up out of Egypt, I will be your God. Here's the commands you will follow. If you do not follow them, if you continue to defy me over time, I will be a judge and a curse to you. If you follow them, I will be a blessing and give life to you. So that's the what you call a conditional covenant. In other words, if you do this, then you get that. The Abrahamic is an unconditional covenant. It's just God straight saying, this is what I'm going to do. And like I said, the covenant with Moses and to all of Israel through Moses falls under the bigger covenants of Abraham. And by the way, this is a very good comfort for us because we are operating within that fulfilled covenants of Christ. We are still the continuation of Israel through Christ and faith. That covenant is still going for us. And is God going to forsake that covenant with his people, no matter how bad some of those people get? No. What will happen, as he has always promised time and again, is he will refine his people, he will remove the dross, he will keep for himself a righteous remnant who will be redeemed by Christ, or as Christ himself puts it, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell itself will not prevail against it.
So would over the Abraham covenant, like Adam and Eve, something?
Right. Adam and Eve have that covenant. I gotta be careful about my time here. Okay. Adam and Eve have a covenant too, and it is also an unconditional covenant. That one is the promise.
That's what the name is.
Right.
It's just called the promise.
It's an unconditional promise. We can call it the Adamic covenant if we want to use the fancier terms. I'm just speaking more colloquially. He makes the promise, what we sometimes call, if you want an even fancier word, the proto-evangelion, the first gospel, the first promise to save the world from sin to Eve, or rather, he makes it to the serpent. He said, he makes it to Eve. My bad. Says, hold on, now I have to think about it. I'm getting my timeline mixed up, which is stupid. And he says it in the threat to the serpent. I will set enmity between your offspring and her offspring, and you will strike his heel, he will crush your head. That's a point to the offspring that would become Christ. The Abrahamic covenant isn't a separate covenant. It's the same one carried forward in time with a little more specificity. So one of Eve's offspring will be the Savior, And then to Abraham, it's reiterated again, one of your offspring will be the Savior. And interestingly enough, quite apart from the covenant of Moses is the Davidic covenant, which is, again, just an extension of the Abrahamic covenant. I will raise up for you from one of your descendants, one who will sit on the throne, and of his kingdom and rule there will be no end. It's, again, unconditional promise to Christ. I know we kind of got off the field on this whole covenantal history.
It's got kind of a crappy covenant.
Well, it's
conditional.
conditional.
The other one's
It's
got the good ones.
right. We should talk about this more next time because we're out of time. But the idea is being part of the conditional covenant doesn't mean, or the unconditional covenant doesn't mean suddenly now it doesn't matter how you behave. The Mosaic covenant is basically, it's a feature of the Abrahamic covenant. It's saying, in effect, since I have called you my own, this is how I expect you to live. As though I am holy, I am your rock, I am your redeemer. And if you act like I am not, then I will, because of my undying faithfulness to you, discipline you harshly to call you back. As Hebrews says, God disciplines us as he disciplines a father, or as a father disciplines his child. All right, I really have to get going, so let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All righty. Time waits for no one. Okay, I'll take the truck.